Thanks for joining us today for the PNAMP Remote Sensing Forum. If we haven't met, my name is Amy Poles, and I work for the USGS and the Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership, or PNAMP for short. And I co-lead this forum with Lauren Burns from CritFIC, who you'll meet in just a couple of minutes. But first, today's agenda. So after I wrap up the welcome, we'll kick off some live polling, and we're going to be using polls throughout the meeting to get to know you and to get some feedback. Lauren's going to share a few updates that we think will be of interest to the forum. And then after that, we're going to have two presentations that we're really excited about. There will be time for questions immediately following each presentation. And then at the end, we'll open it up for additional questions and discussion if folks are interested. But first, a couple of tips. So please make sure you're muted when you're not speaking. If you're on the phone, you can use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. If you're using computer for audio, you mute and unmute yourself using that microphone icon on the toolbar. And where you find that toolbar sort of depends on whether you're using the browser version or the desktop app. And so it might be fixed at the top right of your meeting window, or you might need to hover your mouse to get it to appear near the bottom middle of the meeting window. And then we invite you to use the chat at any time. We'll respond to technical issues as best we can, and we will circle back to any questions or comments for the speakers during the Q&A. Occasionally, folks have trouble accessing the chat, and if that happens to you, I apologize. If you do have questions and you can't get that to work for you, you can always ask them out loud during the Q&A. I think that's all I have for tips, and so I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Lauren.
Hey everyone, let me just switch screens here. All right, so we want to gather some information about everybody. So if you could please either do two things: access the link that Amy is going to throw into the chat. We're going to take a quick Mentimeter poll. So we like to start off each of the meetings with a fun polling question. So either use your phone, open up your camera, and just scan the QR code that you see on the right side of the screen here, or access the link in the chat. And the fun polling question for today, since it's now fall, are pumpkin facts. So which of the following statements are true? So as voters start to put in their answers, we should see some live results here. Alrighty, at least one person's voting. There we go, we got a couple. Great, looks like people are able to use the Menti poll. All right, so looks like we have pretty good attendance, or pretty good polling for the number of people in attendance. So the only one of these statements that wasn't true are pumpkins grow on every continent. So good job to the folks that selected pumpkins are 90% water. Every part of the pumpkin is edible. Pumpkins are technically fruit, and the world's heaviest pumpkin weighed greater than 2,600 pounds. Alrighty, and just a reminder, we'll periodically be conducting these live pollings throughout the forum meeting. We're hoping to get some responses from users about their technical expertise or level of knowledge, and then just also some feedback about what users would like to get out of the forum. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So a few updates. In case you're new here, this is the Remote Sensing Forum. We started just under a year ago with the Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership. And one of the goals of the forum is to also disseminate information that might be useful to broader forum participants. So one of the things that the organizing committee, which is made up of myself and Amy, and a few other technical experts throughout the basin have been working on is putting out a white paper. So we're working on putting out a white paper that will go through kind of the stages of developing a drone monitoring program. And we intend to put this out in early winter to get feedback from users, from forum participants, and then put out a final draft somewhere early spring or before the field season, ideally. So hopefully this will be something that forum users can reference to hopefully standardize methods in their own practices and continue to ask advice from other experts in the basin. The second really exciting thing is this has been something that's been in the works for a couple years now. NASA originally had a scoping period in 2018 where they held what they called the 2018 assessment, Columbia Basin Needs Assessment Workshop. And from that, they solicited feedback from individuals in the basin requesting information about projects that would be useful based on NASA products. So with the collaboration of this PNAMP remote sensing forum, myself and one of my fellow CritFix staff members, Seth Wyatt, responded to NASA's request for information and ended up getting some funding. So that funding is going to be used to develop a data portal and platform in combination with Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission and PNAMP, as well as some folks from NOAA, that will allow for easier access to remote sensing data, aquatic remote sensing data in the Pacific Northwest, as well as fisheries data, and some cool data visualizations. So those things are also in the works. I also just want to note that one of the upcoming things that the organizing committee might be working on in the future, based on some of the feedback that we've gotten from individuals and forum users in the basin, is the need to collect metadata and share data between agencies in the basin. So assessing the data sharing needs and making it easier to get the data into the hands of people that want it. So those are a couple updates that we have for you since our June meeting. Our next meeting will be held in early December, so stay tuned for an announcement on that. We already have 2 speakers lined up for that, and it should be a great meeting. Hope you can make it. And just a reminder for those of you, like I said, that are new here, this is the Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership Remote Sensing Forum. And the goals of the forum are to essentially get data into the hands of users and create a network where users can share and reference information. So we've created a Microsoft Teams forum page in which you can ask and answer questions, share resources, and then also grow a network. We're hoping to grow a network of users that all are experiencing similar issues or looking for similar information related to remote sensing. So that's the purpose of the forum. If you'd like to sign up for the forum, which we hope you do, you can go to the Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership webpage. And so this is a printout of the webpage here. If you scroll down to the bottom of the remote sensing forum page, you'll see a couple options on how to join. And Amy's going to throw some of these links into the chat. So there's 2 things that you need to do. The first is to actually sign up for the listserv. And so signing up for the listserv just means that you'll get email notifications about upcoming events, upcoming webinars, any news that we might be distributing. And then you can also sign up for the Microsoft Teams page. So this is a twofold process. So sign up for the listserv to get email updates, and also sign up for access to the Microsoft Teams page. And we have some instructions here on the processes that you need to go through to get access, since this is it's a Microsoft Teams page that's being hosted through the Department of Interior, so there's a few more security checks than normal, but bear with us. There's some useful information already up there about cool papers that we're sharing. We try to post pretty frequently throughout the month to give users an update on new and latest technology, tips and tricks. And then also there's some introductions. So you can meet all of the organizing committee members.
Again, different levels of interest in politics and different levels of curiosity, really.
Okay, so please go to the forum page and sign up if you haven't already. There's also a YouTube channel where all of these, you'll see that just above PNAMP's YouTube channel, where you can go and reference past forum videos that have been recorded. So I say this every time, I think I have to now, but like and subscribe, and feel free to reference those at your leisure. Alrighty, so this isn't a polling question, but I just want to reference that this meeting is almost a two-part series. So at our June meeting, if you haven't watched it already, I recommend you go back and review the two awesome presentations that we had from Kai Ross with Kramer Fish Sciences and Rakeem Scholes that gave presentations back at our June 2021 forum meeting. And at that forum meeting, we polled the audience. How do you envision that automated image extraction and machine learning could be incorporated into your current work? And we noticed that a lot of the responses were monitoring focused. Monitoring, habitat monitoring, pre and post restoration monitoring. So with that, we'd like to gain some additional information about today's participants. So again, Amy's going to throw the link back into the chat, or you can use your camera to get to the poll. Guys. So we also asked this at the June meeting as well, but we're still trying to collect data on the knowledge base of our participants for these forum meetings. So please go to the link and answer what's your level of familiarity with artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is also useful. This is also going to be useful for our presenters, for them to know what level of detail they should go into with their presentations today. Great. Yeah, lots of newbies here. That's okay. That's what we want. And I would recommend for anybody that considers themselves a newbie or beginner, these presentations go hand in hand with our June presentation. So if you like what you've seen today, go back and rewatch the presentations from our June meeting on the PNAMP YouTube channel. Alrighty, so we have a couple of people that feel like they're pretty highly skilled, but it looks like there's a lot of newbies and beginners out there in the audience. So with that, Matt, hopefully that's helpful to you. And we're gonna launch into our first speaker today. So Matt Barker is a PhD student at Oregon State University, and he's going to be discussing estimating two-dimensional area of coarse woody material from UAS imagery. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic or the computer screen over to Matt.
All right. All right, are people able to see my screen?
Yes, I'm seeing it. And it looks like you're about to go into slideshow mode. I'm seeing the presenter view though. There you go.
All right. Thanks, Lauren, for the introduction. And really appreciate having the opportunity to speak here at PNAMP today. And it was good to get a sense of people's level with machine learning. I still consider myself sort of just intermediate. I applied it a little bit in my thesis, and I'm still working on it for my dissertation to get a little bit deeper into it. But today I'm going to be discussing methods to estimate two-dimensional wood area from UAS imagery. Just a brief background about myself. I'm currently a PhD student studying in the forestry department at Oregon State University, and I'm an associate of the Aerial Information Systems Lab that's directed by my advisor, Dr. Michael Wing. And additionally, I'm an ORISE research participant collaborating with the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Facility and some folks over there on some other projects. A little outline of what I'm going to try to cover today. We're going to go through a little bit of this stage 0 restoration background and the importance of coarse woody debris, or as it's sometimes referred, coarse woody material. We'll talk about the site background itself, potential reasons to monitor using UAS, the platform that we used, how we acquired our imagery, and some of the image processing techniques. And then I'll briefly touch on image segmentation or object-based image analysis. I'll go through a brief intro of the machine learning classifier that I applied to predict the classes of the image objects. And then we'll go into a little bit more detail on model training, prediction, and then accuracy assessment. And then I'm going to talk about a slightly different approach to estimating wood area by taking more of a sample-based approach. And then we'll go through results and some recommendations from some of this preliminary work. So first, a little background about stage 0 restoration. It's a form of management focused on restoring processes that may have existed prior to anthropogenic influence in riparian areas. Designers for this project in the South Fork Mackenzie used GIS to identify what was believed to be the geomorphic grade line. And then they sought to introduce wood sediment and features into the landscape, thereby connecting to the historic floodplain and the more historic braided network of streams, and hopefully provide habitat for salmonids and increase roughness and heterogeneity throughout the environment. Some of the objectives from the Mackenzie Watershed Council include increasing sediment storage, channel complexity, and the diversity of geomorphic features like banks and islands throughout the site. And I think Wyatt may touch on some of those in Whychus. And then what I'm focused on for this talk is this objective of increasing wood abundance by 1,000% and retaining 90% wood through 5 years. So we're taking these multi-temporal image acquisitions of the site. Some of the ecological functions provided by coarse woody debris, they help to stabilize banks, creates pools and riffles and bar formation, helps to contribute nutrients to the ecosystem, providing food and habitat for macroinvertebrates that then also provide food for the fish. And also coarse wood provides refuge, spawning substrate, and habitat for fish, as well as some thermal heterogeneity throughout the site. So that's why we're also recording thermal imagery in the site. And by distributing some of the velocity throughout the site, you end up with these undercut banks rather than just eroded banks. So that also provides some more habitat heterogeneity. So why do we want to monitor this site with UAS? Well, as you can see in this image, they deposited a lot of wood into the stream. It was a multi-million-dollar project. And when ground crews are in the field sampling, it can be pretty hazardous to navigate and slow going. So it's a benefit of efficiency and safety. So UAS, it allows us to do these on-demand acquisitions. So as long as we're coordinating with local authorities and the weather is agreeable, we're not getting a lot of rain, and as long as the lighting conditions are fair so that we're not getting scattered clouds that are moving throughout the flight, we can pretty much put the aircraft up whenever we need to. allowing us to capture different low and high flow instances in the environment. And then quadcopters are actually able to cover greater than 150 acres in an afternoon. So a site like this, it's pretty well suited for a quadcopter. But if you had a larger site, you could consider using a fixed wing aircraft. And now fixed wing aircrafts, you can take off vertically. So if you're limited to your takeoff and landing zone, you'd have the option to launch in a clearing in the canopy and be able to cover more area with that option. Also, I talked a little bit about safety, trying to traverse these logs in the site. It's a little bit difficult, and it's going to become more difficult as the logs start to decay. And having so many obstructions in the stream, it makes it pretty difficult to pass with a raft or anything else. So it can be a little bit dangerous. And then the platform allows us to easily swap our payload. So if you had potentially a larger aircraft, you could even carry 2 payloads if you were interested in capturing LiDAR at the same time as multispectral imagery. There are now larger platforms that would allow you to do that. And then being able to fly at 400 feet or lower really provides the advantage of achieving a more resolute ground sampling distance. And this allows us to discern the features of interest that we're interested in monitoring in this project. We're able to even do these photo plot flights where we fly at even lower altitudes and can discern up to millimeter resolution and start to classify sediment class size. So some of the monitoring objectives that I'm interested in are capturing these low and high flow events throughout the year and just mapping which areas of the site are underwater, whether the coarse woody debris is becoming submerged, and whether it's moving and there's change throughout the year after high flow events. We also have this question about design efficiency. So how many plots should we be sampling to achieve a desired precision? And then a little bit of background about the site itself. This is the South Fork of the McKenzie River. It's a stage 0 restoration site, and I'll be talking about the phase 1 of the project today. It's approximately 50 miles east of Springfield in Blue River, Oregon. And it's just downstream of the Cougar Reservoir, which was built in the 1960s. And then the site itself is an alluvial fan with an elevation ranging from 1,000 to 1,100 feet and annual precipitation of 2,000 to 2,500 millimeters. Phase 1 was completed in 2018, just prior to the 2020 holiday farm fire. So now we have this added pre and post fire interest for this image set. And then just briefly about the platform. For the aircraft, we're flying a DJI Matrice 200 version 2. Again, it's a quadcopter. Since we purchased this aircraft, obviously there have been new iterations. There's now a Matrice 210, which is equipped with a real-time kinematic, which would reduce the need to install so much ground control as we had to do. So that would be another efficiency gain. And then there's even larger platforms like the Matrice 300 that are also equipped with RTK, and you'd be able to also equip simultaneous LiDAR. The sensor that we're using is a multispectral camera produced by Whychus called the Altum. And in my slides that I'll be sharing later, I've linked a flight calculator, which allows you to estimate the approximate time it would be required to fly an area, what ground sampling distance you could expect to achieve flying at your given altitude, and whether your camera will be able to fire fast enough to achieve the desired overlap that you want in the site. And for the flight planning software, which we use to automate these gridded flights, we're using DJI Pilot flight software. It's somewhat limiting, but it's getting better. It doesn't necessarily maintain the same altitude above ground level, but you can use software like Google Earth or even Metashape to bring in a digital elevation model and then export your flight as a KML to the DJI pilot software to actually maintain your altitude above ground level. And then at the bottom here, I've just included specs of the different bands that are being recorded. So we have blue, green, red, and then we have red edge and near infrared that allow us to calculate vegetation indices. And then we're also recording radiant temperature in the long wave infrared. So the most important part about all this is just planning, coordination, and safety. As I mentioned, you can delineate the route with DJI Pilot, and we always prefer to fly these image acquisitions with 80% front and side overlap to ensure that we're able to actually reconstruct an orthomosaic when we get back to the lab. And we flew this particular flight at 10 meters per second, which required about an hour and 15 minutes of flight. Given that the batteries last about 25 minutes with the payload, we have to swap 3 sets of batteries throughout the flight. And we always try to capture within plus or minus 2 hours solar noon to minimize shadows, although it can be pretty tricky throughout this site to reduce those shadows. We conducted these flights within 120 meters of the canopy, which gave us a ground sampling distance of approximately 6 centimeters. And before each flight, I'm required to contact the USFS aviation manager in the district, and I also call Eugene Dispatch. And this is good practice because if there's special flight operations, they can alert you and you can have an idea of when those might be taking place. If there's helicopter surveys in the area, it's good to just stay out of their way and not have a conflict of airspace. And then typically the crew consists of 2 people. Myself as a pilot, I always prefer to have a visual observer so that someone can keep their eyes on the aircraft if I have to take my eyes off to look at the POV camera. And it just helps have another set of eyes to watch for vultures or low-flying aircraft. And another valuable part of having a visual observer is they can use a flight radar app, such as Flight Radar 24. And as long as you have cell service in the area, you can see which aircraft are potentially in your airspace and then what elevation they're at. So you know if you need to yield the sky to those aircraft. I also like to check the Before You Fly app because it gives conditions during the flight, letting you know maybe if it's gusting above 20 miles per hour, we don't want to put the aircraft up. And if if you are flying in restricted airspace, you're able to request approval through LANCE, and that's automatic. So it allows you to fly in accordance with the Part 107 regulations. Once we acquire the imagery, we use Agisoft Metashape photogrammetry software, although you can also use something like Pix4D, and they're pretty similar. But the basic workflow is we bring the images off of the flash drive from the camera, and we process them as a multi-camera system. Since we're recording 6 images each time the camera captures, then we perform a photo alignment with low accuracy. We bring in those ground control points that I mentioned. We recorded those with Trimble GeoXH. So after post-processing, we have about a decimeter of accuracy. And then we can filter the photos by those locations and then move the marker so that it's centered on the ground control target. After we've imported the ground control, we do another photo alignment. This time we do high accuracy, and then we perform a camera optimization routine. We use gradual selection to filter out low accuracy points and re-optimize the cameras, and we might do this 3 times or so. Then we generate a dense point cloud. We build our digital elevation model from the dense cloud. Then we can perform our radiometric calibration. So before and after each flight, we image the reflectance panel that's included with the sensor, And this panel has known albedo values that were captured in a lab. And we bring in that information in a CSV, and we're able to calibrate the imagery based on the lighting conditions during the flight, allowing us to compare reflectance at sensor reflectance through time. And then we generate our orthomosaic, and we can convert from the digital number to at sensor reflectance, and then export the products that we're interested in. So you can get a structure for motion point cloud, the digital elevation model as a TIFF, and your orthomosaic. And then lastly, you might have secondary products that you're interested in. As I mentioned, we can get vegetation indices using the near infrared band. So you can do this either in Metashape with their raster calculator, or you can do it in GIS software, or even R or Python or whatever software you're interested in. And I've also linked a recommended workflow that goes into a little bit more detail from the camera manufacturer. So here's an example of the orthomosaic product that we get. You can see that the environment's a lot more complex now, and we've connected to the historical floodplain here, and there's been a lot of wood deposited. So when you see this, you can imagine if you're trying to discern wood through these multi-temporal captures, it could be pretty time consuming. So we thought maybe we would try to automate this using a machine learning classifier and object-based image analysis. So rather than classify on a per pixel basis, we can reduce some of that noise by clustering similar pixels into what are known as image objects. And these basically just show up as a feature class that most people here are likely familiar with. This reduces the noise associated with the pixels. And in this case, I used Trimble eCognition, although there is a segmentation routine built into ArcGIS Pro, and I'm sure QGIS probably has one at this point. But Trimble eCognition offers the benefit of considering spatial properties like texture, proximity, size, and shape. And then we get these feature classes that have 40 or so variables that resemble zonal statistics that we use for our classifier. So I chose to stick with the random forest classifier in this instance. It's basically an ensemble of decision trees, and I put kind of a redundant decision tree on the right just to illustrate what happens in a decision tree. So we have 3 schools in the Pac-12. We have Cal Poly, University of Oregon, and Oregon State. First, the classifier may ask, is it a college in Oregon? If no, then it classifies as Cal Poly. If yes, it may ask, is the mascot a beaver? If yes, then Oregon State, and then if no, University of Oregon. So the ensemble approach, in this case, took 500 decision trees, and it takes the classification with the most vote and classifies that image object into that class. It's a non-parametric approach, so it doesn't have the model assumptions like normality, and it's robust to overfitting because of the law of large numbers. We implemented the classifier in the Caret package in RStudio, although there's other options in R like MLR, or if you like Python, there's scikit-learn. ArcGIS also has a classification routine built into it, although in the past I've found it to be a little bit difficult to tune and to be sure of what your parameters were going into it. But it's a good option for people who are potentially new to machine learning, and it will give you a variable importance plot and confusion matrix to be able to actually assess how your classifier performed. So first we delineate the training area in GIS software. I selected a 3.5 acre area that contained features that I thought represented the entire study area. So there were islands, banks, barren areas, forests, wood. We manually classified 1,264 images, and we removed unknown objects and collapsed the classes, resulting in 1,200 image objects. Then to assess accuracy, it's important to split your data. In this case, we used 10 repetitions of 10-fold cross-validation. So we split the 1,200 classified observations into 10 folds, and we'll hold one out and then use the 9 other folds to train the model, and then assess the accuracy on that fold that was held out, and we do that 10 times. And then we can assess our accuracy that way, and then do our prediction for the entire site. So here's an example of that training area. The blue on the left shows the red on the right shows all the potential image objects, and then the blue on the left shows the image objects that were randomly selected to be classified, to be manually classified. And the training classes weren't balanced, and I did that because it was kind of a small training data set in the scheme of machine learning, and then I only had 1,200 objects. So after collapsing, there were about 800 wood objects and then 400 non-wood objects. So here's a result of applying the model to the entire site. I zoomed in on an area to show that the classifier is not perfect. It's underestimating wood. And then if I summarize the results of the classifier within the site, we get about 8,400 square meters of wood. And then I tried 3 different models. In the first model, we had 3 classes: wood, not wood, and other. In the second model, coarse woody debris, fine woody debris, and other. And then in the third model, coarse woody debris and not coarse woody debris. So to assess the accuracy, you can either take a look at accuracy, but I prefer kappa because it takes into account the likelihood of randomly classifying an object correctly. And kappa ranges from -1 to 1, where 0 would be no difference than if we were to just randomly assign classes to the objects. 1 would be a perfect classifier, and anything negative would actually do worse than random chance. So like I said, model 3 had the highest kappa, so that's what we applied to get those predictions in the previous slide. And then here's just a look at that confusion matrix that I mentioned. So along the side, we have what the classifier predicted, and on the top, we have our reference data set. So the green cells actually indicate where the classifier was in agreement with the reference data set. And we use those values to calculate kappa and accuracy. And I should mention too that there is a somewhat subjective scale to interpret kappa by Landis and Koch from their 1977 paper. And 0.61 to 0.8, which we were getting in this study, indicates substantial agreement between the observer and the classifier. But we wanted to take another approach to get a more quantitative assessment of how the model's performing. So we took a sampling-based approach. Using a previously collected orthomosaic, we generated a tessellation of about 12,052 square meter hexagons throughout the phase 1 site of the restoration area. Then we systematically sampled every 29th and classified those as either forest, barren, or wetted plots. We removed the forested plots, and then we randomly selected 40 for ground sampling. Within the 40, to increase efficiency in the field, we generated 4 1-meter radius subplots at center, 30 degrees, 150, and 270 degree azimuths. They were 3 meters from the center, and each subplot had an area of pi meter squared, or a radius of 1 meter. Then we ground sampled the selected plots by visually estimating the % of coarse woody material cover in those plots. Then we went back to the lab, and using the orthomosaic, we delineated the plots on the orthomosaic, and then delineated coarse woody material by hand using the polygon tool and ArcGIS Pro. Then we were able to summarize the manually delineated wood area and the results of the classified wood area within the plots, the hexagon plots, and the circular subplots. So here's just an example of plot 14. We have our hexagon, which is our primary unit, our plot level, and then we have our circle plots, which are subplots. And then in the middle, you can see the results of the random forest classifier, and to the right is the manually delineated. So again, even in plot 14, it's somewhat underclassified, the coarse woody material. Then to see how the ground estimated wood checked out with the manually delineated wood, I did a linear regression. The p-value was less than 0.005, and the adjusted R-squared was relatively high at 0.47, indicating that what we're delineating in ArcGIS is in agreement with what we're somewhat subjectively estimating on the ground. And then to take this a little bit further and where I want to go in the future, this is still a little bit preliminary, but we can get total estimates of wood area with these sampling-based estimators, and there's 5 that I wanted to use. So we use the results of the ground estimated wood to get this 2-stage sampling estimate from the subplots. So we estimate a total wood area of 35,000 square meters. And then we did a simple random sample just using the manually delineated wood and getting an estimated total of 22,000 with this a wider confidence interval and higher variance. But in the future, I'd like to also apply this using a difference estimator, taking the difference between the random forest results and the manually delineated wood, and then a simple linear regression, and then a generalized regression estimator where I actually bring in auxiliary variables from the zonal statistics and the orthomosaic. So just brief recommendations from the preliminary results. Remote sensing using UAS provides an efficient alternative to measuring the wood in sight, and the manually delineating sample-based approach gives us a more quantitative assessment of our estimates by providing that confidence interval, whereas the results of the machine learning estimate are a little bit more difficult to assess because there's somewhat subjective interpretation of kappa and accuracy metrics. Additionally, it looks like we might apply the manual approach for the other temporal data sets because the machine learning requires both tuning the segmentation algorithm and the model, and the algorithm itself. But there is a potential to investigate rerunning the segmentation routine on the other temporal data sets and using the same model to see how it will perform. Here are the references for people who are interested in those. And I'd like to thank PNAMP for hosting this, and the Mackenzie Watershed Council, OWEB, and US Forest Service for funding. And I'd like to thank my advisor, Michael Wing, and my mentor at the Forest Service, Jonathan Burnett, as well as one of my professors, Dr. Gutierrez. And with that, got a couple minutes for questions, it looks like. And thank you all for being here as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That was a really great presentation, and something that I'm definitely going to come back to and review some of the materials later. So hopefully other people also found this helpful. I know we've been dealing with a lot of these similar questions in our monitoring because stage 0 restoration is becoming more and more frequent, and it's just almost impossible to count every piece of wood on the ground with a crew. So using UAS or LiDAR or other remote sensing methods seems to be the way to go if you're trying to quantify either counts of wood or wood area. But I'll turn it over. It looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. So Richie, go ahead.
Hey, Matt, thanks a bunch. That was super interesting. I just had a question about your methods or your workflow, as I've messed around with random forest classifiers quite a bit too. So when you do the clustering and segmentation and generate, for lack of a better term, zonal statistics, are you using those zonal statistics as your covariates in your random forest, or that's what you're using as your covariates? Yeah.
So I should have linked it in the references, but there's a paper by Queiroz. It's Queiroz, but they've recommended about 40 or so of those covariates from eCognition. And yeah, that's exactly what I did. I used those as my covariates for my random forest. And then you're able to, if you wanted to to trim down those variates, you can take a look at the variable importance plot afterwards, or you might use something like principal component analysis to inform you prior to that classification.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Richie.
All right, we might have time for one other question if there's any others directly from Matt right now. Otherwise, we can move on to the next presentation, and any questions that come up can be addressed in the Q&A and discussion. Richie, you got another one?
Yeah, as long as no one else has one.
Right.
I hate to hog the QA, but I'm just curious why you chose something like a supervised random forest as opposed to more of like the newer deep learning models, neural net, LXNet, things like that, for finding objects and images.
Yeah, and I'm not really an expert at machine learning yet. I've done a little bit of looking into this, and I think part of what I'd like to do is actually look at the gradient boosted machine. I've found that wins a lot of machine learning competitions when it comes to these image classification tasks. I've spoken with a member of my lab who's a little bit more familiar with deep learning, and I've played around with that a little bit. And what I'm finding is that I just don't have a large enough training data set really to see any improvement there. And from what I've played with there, I've actually gotten worse performance. So I think deep learning is really good for things like iNaturalist, or anytime you have like a really big database of training data. I think deep learning is the way to go, and if you have the computational power to do it. But I think for some of this image classification stuff, the more tried and true random forest, gradient boosted machine, those seem to be the approach to take, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. I think as we move forward with this remote sensing forum, there could be some really nice opportunity to leverage other people's imagery data sets to like build a deep learning model like you're talking about. That's something I have high hopes for with this community. Yeah,
and you could envision setting up like a citizen science project and putting the training data out there for people to classify and play with, and really tackle it as a bigger effort there.
Yeah, I like the direction that this is going in. Maybe we can hold something similar to something that University of Washington has hosted in previous years, which is hackathons. Basically, they have geology and remote sensing based hackathons. Basically, Water Hack Week is one where we could distribute the data set and have other people essentially play around with it and present the results. So, good ideas. Things to think on, especially for the forum. Well, thanks again, Matt. Hope you can stick around for the Q&A and discussion. I'm going to take over control again and just invite everyone to fill out our second live polling event. So again, Amy's going to drop the link in the chat or in your camera at the QR link here. And right now what we're asking you are about the solutions that you use for future classification. So what solutions or software have you or do you plan on using for future classification? So Matt was mentioning eCognition. He also mentioned ArcMap or ArcPro. But obviously there's a couple of custom solutions that users have come up with based on, maybe you're a better coder than some of us and you've developed your own scripts. So again, we're just trying to gain some data, polling our community to understand what types of products are being used and possibly provide some recommendations in the future. Great. So yeah. I mean, this isn't totally surprising. In a lot of my research, it seems like there does need to be a mix and match approach where you're using Python and R, some coding languages, in addition to some out-of-the-box software. So, alrighty, thank you for that. And just a follow-up question on this. So if you are using these out-of-the-box solutions, what's the name of the software? So this is just to really get at whether or not all of the user community is using eCognition or ArcMap, and what's the split of that. So please type in on the Mentimeter the name of the software, and it should show up here as bubbles. There we go. Nice. Metashape, ArcPro, QGIS, great. For those of you not familiar, Metashape is a post-processing software that used to be called Agisoft. ArcPro, QGIS, eCognition. Okay. I'm familiar with that. Anybody else want to throw anything out there before we move on? Cloud Compare, great. Cloud Compare is a free and open source software. It's really handy for dealing with dense point clouds. All right, last tools, same thing, dealing with large point clouds related to LiDAR data or dense point clouds. Alrighty. Just a reminder, you guys can go back to these and continue to input information throughout the presentation. So with that, we're going to move on because we're running a little bit short on time. All right, and so our next presenter today is Wyatt McCurdy. He's a remote sensing specialist at Red Castle Resources. He's also a U.S. Forest Service contractor with the Geospatial Technology and Applications Center out of Salt Lake. Today, Wyatt is going to be presenting on a similar topic. Both of our presentations today are stage 0 focused. So his title, the title of his talk is Remote Sensing Methods for Monitoring Stage 0 Restoration Metrics on Whychus Creek Using High Resolution Imagery. And with that, I will yield control to you, Wyatt.
Great, thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Looks great.
All right, excellent. I'll get into it then. I am also presenting on stage 0 restoration metrics, like Matthew, and I'll just go ahead and get started. So this was a collaboration between a few different parties that probably everyone's familiar with. The GTAC, or the Geospatial Technology Application Center, the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council in Bend, Oregon, and we also received funding from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, or OEB. And really, my goal here is just to review methodologies and products that we got from this study that are most pertinent to this group. So with that, I'll go into a little bit about the project need, although I think that Matt covered a little bit of this as well, as far as stage 0 restoration. So the Forest Service and Upper Deschutes Watershed Council had a big and complex stage 0 restoration project in Whychus Creek, a tributary of the Deschutes watershed. And since stage 0 restoration is a relatively complex process with a lot of different effects on the ecosystem, it's not very easily evaluated by traditional on-the-ground methods. Like Matt was saying, there's a bunch of different complications with gathering on-the-ground data, and a little bit of that is just time spent on the ground, and just the amount of the amount of people and time that you need to go out and gather that data, as well as safety, though not so much as in the South Fork and the Mackenzie. So we wanted to explore remote sensing technologies as a means to address this need. So again, stage 0 projects, like Matt was saying, they're designed to restore the valley bottom and really create a depositional stream flow, create a braided and more complex stream that's a better habitat for fish species and promotes a better riparian ecosystem in general. So here's a quick glance at the reaches that we were analyzing on Whychus Creek. And you'll notice that a few of these reaches are listed in phases. And these are the phases of the stage 0 restoration. So phase 1, phase 2B, and phase 2A are either completed or planned restoration activities. And so we looked at a mixture of post-restoration and pre-restoration reaches. And part of our study was comparison between these. I won't really get into the comparison. I'll more get into the methods that we used to derive a couple of these metrics. So again, the objective of this project was really to create a reproducible workflow that we and others can use to monitor stage 0 restoration projects and the effects of those projects. So we derived 4 metrics in our study: inundated area, land cover, large wood debris area, and sediment size. And we got a lot of this data from Matt at OSU and the team there. And lastly, we just developed some technical transfer materials for the cooperators so that reproducibility was really a big focus here. So I just wanted to jump in quickly before we get into the methods to peek at the results. And here is a quick look at one of the metrics that I'll be focusing on, inundation. So this is really what we were looking for a final product. Just a simple raster of inundated area and non-inundated area within a post-restoration reach, in this case. And the second metric that we'll look at is our land cover. And this again is another raster layer. And it contains water area from the inundation layer. It contains herbaceous cover and a variety of different riparian and non-riparian classes of trees and shrubs. And I just showed these results first to give an idea of what the end goal is for the methods that I'll show next. So I'll just go ahead and jump into inundated area and work through some of the methods that we used to derive this metric. So first, we should just list out our inputs. We actually used orthomosaic imagery from the team at OSU and from the Aerial Information Lab. And it contained 6 bands: red, green, blue, red edge, near infrared, and a long wave infrared band. And this is just a false color image, similar to the one that I used for the segmentation and classification of water. So a little bit about the workflow. Using this orthoimagery, we ended up calculating NDVI, similar to Matt again, and we performed a segmentation followed by a sampling and a classification in a random forest classifier. All of this segmentation and classification was done in ArcGIS Pro in its out-of-the-box image analyst toolbox. Additionally, we also did a little bit of post-classification manual edits, just to ensure that we really had continuity in our stream layer, because that was really important to the cooperators. So I'll just go through a quick image slide sequence of those steps that I just listed out. So first, again, we calculated NDVI, and you can see that it differentiates water quite well, especially from vegetation. And this is why we use that particular index, even though it's a vegetation index as opposed to specifically a water index. We then performed a segmentation, which again, I think Matt gave a really good explanation on, really just pulling out objects from a complex pixel-based image, making it simpler and hopefully more accurate to classify. So we did this segmentation on a false color image using NDVI, near infrared, and long wave infrared, represented in the visible bands. Again, one of the limitations of ArcGIS Pro is that you can only use 3 bands for this segmentation, which could be an argument for e-cognition. We used ArcGIS Pro because we thought it would be possibly more widely accessible and more widely usable. I think that's still an open question though. So we again just used the out-of-the-box image classification toolbox. After we performed our segmentation, we sampled really iteratively representative image segments from this segmentation and used the samples and the imagery to create a final classification. And we also used a random trees classifier or a random forest. We then did some minor manual edits to ensure that we saw more connectivity in areas where the stream was occluded by trees. So that's actually it for inundation. Now I'll move on to land cover. So same deal here. First, let's just go through the inputs. We used our first input as now a 7-band orthoimagery orthophoto, because we calculated NDVI. We also used a canopy height model from the US Forest Service database. This was a LiDAR canopy height model that was acquired in 2017 by the Forest Service in this area. And it was a 0.5 by 0.5 meter resolution. We also used, as our final input, a LiDAR-derived relative elevation model supplied by Lauren Mork and Carrie Press from Upper Deschutes Watershed Council and the Forest Service, respectively. And this relative elevation model was designed to measure elevation above the newly constructed valley bottom in this case, in phase 1, the reach that we are discussing from the Whychus Creek study. So again, let's go through a quick overview of our workflow using this data that we gathered. With these inputs, our workflow is really just as follows. We first used our existing water class to mask out and cut away parts of the ortho imagery already known to be water. We then used our canopy height model to identify a combined tree and shrub class using thresholding. We provided a 1 foot height threshold in order to turn our canopy height model into a tree/shrub classification layer. And this is a 2-part workflow, a little bit more complex because it is a multi-class workflow instead of just a 2-class workflow. We went ahead and segmented the remaining areas of the imagery that we hadn't already classified. And we used a random forest classifier again to identify visible herbaceous cover. An important note here, our classifier was not able to tell the difference between bare ground and dry xeric vegetation, and this is why we call our herbaceous class visible herbaceous. It's what the classifier was able to delineate, and we felt that that would be a more accurate representation of that class. Now let's go through our workflow using some example imagery. So first, again, we clipped out areas from our imagery that already contained water. We then used our canopy height raster and applied a 1 foot threshold just in the raster calculator toolbox in ArcGIS Pro to generate a reasonable canopy layer. So on the right, we have a green layer that represents trees and shrubs. We didn't delineate between the two. And on the left, we have our canopy height model with lighter areas representing higher canopy. So now that we had these 2 separate layers, we performed a segmentation on the remaining imagery that we had not already accounted for with these 2 mask layers. So we ran a segmentation on just an RGB image of the ortho image, and then we ran a classification using the ArcGIS Pro Random Forest tool. And again, the Random Forest classifier was both the most popular available tool. Like Matt was saying, it's a very robust tool, and it was also the tool that we found within the ArcGIS Pro toolbox that really performed the best among the out-of-the-box options. One final step that we did before we called it quits was we used our relative elevation model to filter tree and shrub coverage into a few different riparian and upland classes. And this was just based on elevation thresholds put together by Lauren Mork and Carrie Press, based on discharge studies and their experience with this area. So lastly, we combined our layers into a final classification containing different layers of riparian and non-riparian trees and shrubs, visible herbaceous, bare ground, water, and trees overhanging water. And we felt that this was a pretty decent representative classification. Again, we did have to do a lot of iteration of sampling and running, and sampling again and running again before we really got a good representative multi-class classification. So a little bit about the results. this is a semi-automated practice. It's definitely a method that requires user input, and the method was found to do a pretty good job with inundated area and land cover. Some of the other metrics that we measured using ArcGIS Pro, they required a more manual approach. And that's actually all I have for you. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. I'd like to thank the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, OWEB, the Geospatial Technology Application Center, GTAC, and OSU and Matt and his team for supplying all of the imagery. And now I'll turn it over to questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks for that, Wyatt. That was a great presentation and a nice contrast to a different approach than what Matt was using. I'm glad we had both of you on the call because it seems like your presentations are complementary, and Matt even contributed to some of the data in your presentation. So thanks for that. I hope anybody on the call that's using Arc Pro and has questions about the process reaches out to Wyatt. Are there any direct questions for Wyatt's approach at the moment? Casey, go ahead.
Yeah, hi Wyatt. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. I was curious if you had to do a lot of manual editing to the water layer using the approach that you did using NDVI, and if so, how do you determine where the water layer it goes when it's under canopy? Did you have people in the field taking GPS points of the edge of water, or can you explain that process a little bit?
Sure. We did have some GPS points from folks in the field, but that was actually more to try to get an assessment of riparian vegetation area and not so much for water. So we didn't actually have quite a lot of validation data. We did have a lot of cooperation from Lauren and Carrie, who were very familiar with the area, and we used a lot of their expertise to do image interpretation and check the results as we went. So we didn't use as much of a classic accuracy assessment, which is definitely one limitation. With the water delineation, it was actually pretty easy to find areas where the canopy was occluding visible water, both in RGB ortho imagery. Usually it was pretty clear that you had a overhang of canopy and or canopy shadowing. We also used the relative elevation model to a certain extent, although I think that the ortho imagery was more helpful with the manual delineation.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps we can come back to that question in just a minute during the Q&A portion, because I do think that that's an important point. And both Wyatt and Matt were working on kind of lower valley, broader stretches of river. And I do know that some of us work kind of up in headwater tributaries where canopy cover can be more dense. You're not working in kind of wider valley bottoms. So let's come back to that, Casey. I'm hoping maybe a few others on the call, or potentially some of the organizing committee members, Richie or Jane, have some input on that. Are there any other direct questions for Wyatt before we move on?
This is Richie. I have a question for you, Wyatt. I noticed you guys were leveraging LiDAR data as well. Some of the similar products can be produced from like Metashape, for example, a DEM or a relative surface model. Have you guys thought about trying to come up with a similar workflow where you only use UAS generated data instead of importing LiDAR products?
That's a good question. I know that there are several UAS generated generated products that you can use to get a sort of surface model. I know that stereo imagery is one option to get a surface, and that is and I guess I don't have a great answer for you because I'm not familiar with differences in cost and effort between stereo imagery and LiDAR. I think that the LiDAR was very helpful and definitely contributed to the accuracy of the classification. I guess I do think that there are methods that you can use using just UAS platforms. Like Matt was saying, I know that you can attach LiDAR sensors to UASs, or there are a variety of options that you can use just with optical data, but I know that LiDAR definitely helps. It was a really big asset for us. And I don't know if it's necessarily something that we looked at replacing. And I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you than that. I know there's quite a lot of different optical sources that you can use in lieu of LiDAR, but I don't have enough familiarity to really give you a comprehensive answer.
Yeah, no worries. I just figured I'd ask.
Alrighty, well, let's end the questions for Wyatt there, and move on to the last live polling event that we have for this meeting. So Amy, if you could please drop the link in the chat again, or use your phone to scan the QR code. And right now we want to know if you or your organization have remote sensing data that could be shared with the broader community. So this is getting at something that Matt and Richie kind of brought up midway through this meeting of potentially collecting and sharing remotely sensed data from different organizations that have remote sensing programs throughout the Pacific Northwest, and making it more broadly available and more accessible to individuals outside of your affiliated organization. In my personal experience, I know that one of the most difficult parts of this is just getting in contact with the right person. Oftentimes people are very willing to share remotely sensed information pending, it's not being collected near private properties or, over federal facilities, but it definitely is useful for the broader community for increasing your sample size and working with different data sets, different areas. Okay, so it looks like, most people that are still on the call possibly have some remotely sensed information that's available and would be willing to share. So again, this is one of those topics that the Remote Sensing Forum and the organizing committee are going to be doing some additional thinking on, how we can census the data that's available and create a list of contacts to put the wider forum participants in contact with. So with that, let's just move on here. Does anybody have any questions or comments. And if there's no pointed questions or comments about either of the presenters today, we could definitely circle back to the question that Casey Justice brought up about tree cover. In this image right here, which was collected out in Eastern Oregon by Freshwater Illustrated, might be a good example imagery for that question. You have a lot of canopy cover, a braided channel, and it's not super obvious where all of the water is. So with that, do we have any questions more broadly about remote sensing or the forum or either of these presentations?
Hey, this is Casey. Since you raised the question about how to delineate water in areas with high canopy cover, I guess I would maybe want to ask Richie, if he's still on, how your process has evolved over time. I know you guys were using a Arrow 100 unit to denote edge of water and channel unit boundaries. And then I think you upgraded your drone technology, and now you guys have multi-spec, I think the Altum Micasense sensor as well. And I'm curious, are you finding that you don't have to do a lot of manual editing or capturing of edge of water locations in the field, and that you're able to just use the drone imagery pretty readily to get edge of water in a variety of canopy conditions?
And Casey, I don't know if Richie, it looks like Richie is still on the call.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, if anybody else has any experience dealing with that topic.
The right person, but when we were doing the Whychus study, we didn't really experiment with using elevation all that much to delineate, just because it was a more open scene and it just didn't make sense within our time frame. But I know that Jonathan and I, for South Fork at Mackenzie, were doing a similar sort of water classification, and there, since the canopy cover is so dense, we are thinking about using sort of a combination of the water classification plus I guess more LiDAR imagery to sort of heuristically find that water edge, and just compare elevations in the LiDAR surface model to areas that are already classified in the imagery. And I guess I guess there are options to combine image classification and then elevation data to sort of expand the image classification when you can't actually see where the water is.
Yeah, having that LiDAR data is very handy. I guess I'm kind of thinking about scenarios where you might not have LiDAR imagery to accompany your drone data. But yeah, thank you.
Hey Casey, sorry, someone was distracting me. I heard part of your question. One of the things that we did was sort of moved away from aerial area estimates of the wetted channel, and we are working in like 1D linear distances, because that allowed us to still generate CHAMP-like metrics, so things that we could crosswalk between what was measured in the field in the past and what we were getting from our drone sensor. We really struggled to find the wetted edge in these tributary streams. We did mess around a little bit with the arrow, well, not a little bit, a lot of it, taking wetted edge measurements and then trying to calculate average widths from that and then multiplying it by the length to get areas. But we just felt like the amount of work and the value added was pretty minimal. So we just sort of stuck with the linear distance estimates, and then that allowed us to still get like channel unit frequency and percent of various types of channel units. But yeah, we could never really find a good solution for finding the wetted edges.
Oh, thanks, Richie. That's really interesting and makes a lot of sense. We're always looking for ways to make things more efficient in the field, and if we don't need to collect some of that data, then it'd be awesome to not have to try to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what we found was just like, with our capacity modeling, our fish habitat relationships, that you don't really lose much predictive power whether you're measuring area or linear distance as it relates to fish, I guess. But then like in side channels, for example, when you can't see the side channel at all, we were collecting center line points with the arrow to just ensure that we were able to locate the center of that side channel. So the arrow data and the drone data actually work nicely together. It's pretty easy to incorporate that stuff when you get everything projected and on the right coordinate system.
Yeah. Thanks, Richie.
All right, thanks, Richie. And it looks like we have a question from Jonathan Burnett. Go ahead, Jonathan. I think you're unmuted, Jonathan, but we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Okay, yep, thank you. Hey, Richie, this is John Burnett at the PNW Research Station. I just had a quick question about what you just talked about, the method for combining the arrow and the drone into something that's usable by CHAMP. Have you written anything up about that? Because that would be really useful for thinking about how to summarize our South Fork data.
No, I haven't, unfortunately. We're in the process of developing a toolkit to find the center line of a river in drone imagery. But we don't really have anything officially written up. I would hope to have something maybe by this summer as we get our field crews back out there, and I can definitely keep you in the loop on that. But unfortunately, I don't have anything to share at the moment other than, our protocol, essentially.
Gotcha. Yeah, maybe, and I don't want to take anybody else's time up with this, but maybe you and I can chat sometime down the road here and talk about that or share that. Are you with the USGS now or the Army Corps?
No, I'm with a private consultancy.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And I know, like, I would probably pull Lauren in and the CritFic folks as well, because we've been collaborating with them on protocol development. And I know, one of the initiatives of this PNAMP group is to eventually have a protocol or a series of protocols out to the community, peer reviewed and ready for use. And then also, some of that information about how to process the data moving forward.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome.
Right on. Thanks, Richie. Alrighty, it's now 11 a.m. I want to thank you all for joining us for our third installment of the PNAMP Remote Sensing Forum. Like I said, our fourth meeting to conclude our first year of the forum will be held in early December. And we already have 2 speakers lined up. So please sign up for the Remote Sensing Forum listserv and join the Microsoft Teams page to stay up to date on announcements, cool tips and tricks, interesting articles, and also, announcements of our upcoming meetings. And with that, thank you all for joining us and hope you have a great rest of your week. Amy, do you have anything else to say?
No, sounds good. Thanks everybody for coming. Hope to see you next time.